The alarm pierced through the darkness at 4:47 a.m., 3 minutes before it was set to ring. Marcus had been awake for the past 23 minutes, staring at the ceiling, his mind already churning through the day ahead. This had become his ritual over the past month, waking before the world stirred, in those precious moments when silence held dominion over chaos. 31 days ago, Marcus had been a different man entirely. He had been the embodiment of mediocrity disguised as competence, floating through life on a raft of excuses and half-hearted efforts. His days began with the snooze button, sometimes hit 3, 4, even 5 times, and ended with the blue glow of his phone screen, scrolling through other people's highlight reels while his own life remained stubbornly ordinary. The transformation had begun with a single, devastating realization: he was his own worst enemy, and the enemy was winning. The concept of destroying one's weak self is not metaphorical poetry, it is surgical precision applied to the soul. It requires the unflinching ability to identify every weakness, every excuse, every comfortable lie that has been carefully constructed over years of choosing the path of least resistance. The weak self is cunning. It speaks in the voice of reason, suggesting that tomorrow would be better for change, that circumstances need to align perfectly before action can be taken, that comfort is deserved after the imagined struggles of an unexamined life. Marcus rose from his bed, not the bed he had been sleeping in 31 days ago. That bed had been a sanctuary of procrastination, surrounded by the debris of incomplete projects and abandoned ambitions. This bed was different. It was made with military precision each morning, positioned in a room stripped of distractions, facing a window that framed the eastern horizon where the sun would soon announce another day of possibility. The first week of transformation had been brutal in its simplicity. No grand gestures, no dramatic overhauls, just the systematic dismantling of the infrastructure that supported weakness. The snooze button was disabled. The smartphone was relegated to a drawer, replaced by an analog alarm clock that demanded physical engagement to silence. Social media applications were deleted, not just logged out of, but completely removed, creating friction that the weak mind would find too cumbersome to overcome in moments of impulse. These were not lifestyle adjustments. They were declarations of war against the weak self that had been given quarter for too long. The kitchen had undergone its own transformation. Gone were the convenient poisons, the processed foods that promised satisfaction but delivered only temporary relief from the discomfort of discipline. The refrigerator now contained fuel rather than entertainment, vegetables that required preparation, proteins that demanded planning, foods that nourished rather than merely filled. The weak self had screamed during this purge, conjuring images of deprivation and suffering, but those protests had been met with the cold logic of consequences. Every shortcut in nutrition was a vote for the person Marcus refused to remain. Physical training became the crucible where the weak self made its most desperate stand. The body that had been soft and accommodating suddenly found itself subjected to demands it had never faced. Not the casual exercise of someone maintaining health, but the deliberate cultivation of physical capacity that would serve as the foundation for mental resilience. Each morning, before the world stirred, Marcus engaged in a ritual of voluntary suffering that built something profound, the unshakable knowledge that he could endure more than comfort had ever taught him. The weak self whispered constantly during those early morning sessions. It suggested that this level of intensity was unnecessary, that moderation was wisdom, that the body needed rest more than challenge. These whispers were answered not with argument but with action. Another repetition. Another mile. Another moment of choosing discomfort over ease. The transformation extended beyond the physical realm into the architecture of daily habits. Every morning began with a cold shower, not because hot water was unavailable, but because the weak self recoiled from unnecessary discomfort. This daily act of voluntary adversity served as both practice and reminder. Comfort was a choice, not an entitlement, and choosing discomfort when it served a purpose was a skill that required constant refinement. Reading replaced scrolling. Books that challenged assumptions and demanded engagement replaced the passive consumption of content designed to entertain rather than elevate. Marcus discovered that the weak self preferred information that confirmed existing beliefs and required no intellectual effort to process. The strong self demanded literature that forced growth, that presented uncomfortable truths, that expanded understanding even when that expansion was initially disorienting. The social environment underwent the most painful transformation. Relationships that had been built on shared mediocrity suddenly felt hollow. Friends who gathered to complain rather than create, to consume rather than contribute, found themselves gently but firmly filtered from daily interaction. This was not cruelty but necessity. The weak self drew strength from the permission that surrounded mediocrity provided. When everyone settles for average, average feels like achievement. New connections began to form, drawn from environments where growth was expected rather than exceptional. Gyms at 5 a.m. attracted a different caliber of person than bars at midnight. Libraries on Saturday mornings hosted soul-seeking expansion rather than escape. These new relationships were built not on shared complaints but on shared commitment to becoming more than circumstances suggested was possible. The weak self fought every change with the desperation of an organism facing extinction. It manufactured crises that demanded immediate attention, conjured urgent distractions that seemed to justify abandoning discipline, and created emotional states that made comfort seem medically necessary. These tactics were familiar because they had worked countless times before, successfully derailing previous attempts at transformation. But something was different this time. The systematic approach left no room for negotiation. Each potential weakness had been anticipated and fortified against. The environment had been restructured to support strength rather than enable weakness. Most importantly, the identity had begun to shift from someone trying to change to someone who had already changed. The weak self was no longer the default state but an unwelcome intruder in a life designed for strength. Sleep patterns transformed from chaotic to strategic. The weak self preferred the illusion of flexibility, staying up late because the night offered freedom from responsibility, sleeping in because morning brought demands. The strong self recognized sleep as fuel for transformation rather than escape from engagement. Bedtime became non-negotiable, not because of arbitrary rules but because everything meaningful happened when others were still unconscious. Nutrition evolved from reactive to proactive. The weak self ate when hungry, craved when stressed, and justified poor choices through immediate gratification. The strong self ate to fuel performance, planned meals to support goals, and recognized that every food choice was either building the person he was becoming or maintaining the person he refused to remain. Mental training became as structured as physical training. Meditation was not pursued for relaxation but for the development of awareness that could observe the weak self's tactics without being controlled by them. The practice revealed how much mental energy had been wasted on internal arguments between different versions of himself, energy that could be redirected toward creation rather than consumed by internal conflict. The weak self's final desperate strategy was nostalgia. It painted pictures of how things used to be, suggesting that the old ways had been more authentic, more enjoyable, more sustainable. It whispered that this level of discipline was extreme, that balance meant compromising with weakness, that people would think this transformation was excessive. These whispers were met with a question that cut through every rationalization: what has compromise with weakness ever created? The answer was always the same: the life that had been abandoned 31 days ago. A life of unrealized potential, of dreams deferred until circumstances became perfect, of settling for what was rather than fighting for what could be. The physical changes were obvious but not the most important. The body had become leaner, stronger, more capable, but these were merely external reflections of internal restructuring. The mind had been freed from the constant negotiation between competing desires. Energy that had been spent managing the weak self's demands was now available for creation, contribution, and continuous growth. Decision-making had transformed from exhausting deliberation to swift execution. The weak self had required extensive justification for every choice, constantly seeking permission from circumstances to take action. The strong self operated from principles rather than preferences, making choices based on alignment with the person being created rather than accommodation of immediate desires. Time became abundant rather than scarce. The weak self had filled hours with activities that felt productive but created nothing of lasting value. Social media scrolling disguised as staying informed. Television watching justified as necessary relaxation. Shopping presented as practical necessity. The strong self eliminated these time sinks not through willpower but through replacement. Every minute previously wasted was now invested in activities that compounded over time. The most profound shift was in the relationship with discomfort. The weak self had operated from the assumption that discomfort should be avoided, that ease was the natural state, that struggle indicated something had gone wrong. The strong self recognized discomfort as information, as the signal that growth was occurring, as the price paid for expanding beyond previous limitations. This reframing transformed every challenge from something to be endured into something to be embraced. Difficult conversations became opportunities to practice courage. Physical exhaustion became evidence of proper training intensity. Mental fatigue became confirmation that learning was occurring. The weak self had interpreted these signals as reasons to stop, the strong self recognized them as reasons to continue. Financial discipline replaced financial fantasy. The weak self had spent money to feel better about not making progress, purchasing equipment that remained unused, courses that remained incomplete, solutions that required no personal change to be effective. The strong self invested in tools that were immediately put to use, education that was immediately implemented, and experiences that contributed to the ongoing transformation rather than served as substitutes for it. The workspace underwent its own revolution. Where once there had been a desk that collected clutter and served multiple purposes, there now stood a command center designed for focused work. Every item had a purpose. Every surface was clear except for what was immediately necessary. The physical environment supported mental clarity rather than contributed to mental chaos. The weak self had thrived in chaos because it provided endless excuses for inaction. The strong self required order because clarity of environment supported clarity of thought, and clarity of thought was essential for the kind of sustained effort that transformation demanded. Morning routines became sacred rather than random. Not because of superstition, but because the way each day began determined how that day would unfold. The weak self had started days reactively, checking messages, consuming news, allowing external priorities to establish internal state. The strong self began each day proactively, with activities designed to build strength, clarity, and momentum before engaging with external demands. This routine was not rigid but intentional. It could be adapted to circumstances without being abandoned to convenience. Whether traveling, sick, or facing unusual demands, the core elements remained physical challenge, mental preparation, and intentional engagement with the day ahead. The transformation in the first 10 days had been about destruction, systematically dismantling the infrastructure that supported the weak self. The infrastructure of comfort that made choosing the easy path effortless. The infrastructure of distraction that prevented sustained focus on what mattered most. The infrastructure of excuse that provided rationalization for every abandoned effort. But destruction alone was insufficient. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the space left by the weak self's diminished influence had to be filled with something stronger, more compelling, more sustainable than mere discipline. This is where many transformation attempts failed. They successfully eliminated weaknesses but failed to install strength, leaving a void that the weak self could eventually reclaim. The second phase of transformation focused on construction. Not just building new habits, but building a new identity that made the old habits impossible rather than merely difficult. This identity was not proclaimed but demonstrated, not announced but lived, not achieved but continuously created through choices that aligned with the person Marcus was becoming rather than accommodated the person he had been. The weak self had operated from scarcity. There wasn't enough time, energy, opportunity, or support to pursue meaningful goals. The strong self operated from abundance. Every day contained more opportunity than could possibly be utilized, every challenge contained more potential for growth than initially apparent, every interaction contained more possibility for contribution than comfort seeking had ever revealed. This shift from scarcity to abundance was not positive thinking but practical recognition. The weak self had been so focused on avoiding discomfort that it missed opportunities that required temporary discomfort to access. The strong self was willing to pay the price of temporary discomfort to access lasting benefit. Relationships began to reflect this new operating system. Instead of seeking relationships that provided comfort and validation, Marcus found himself drawn to relationships that challenged assumptions and supported growth. Instead of conversations that confirmed existing beliefs, he sought conversations that expanded understanding. Instead of people who enabled weak patterns, he surrounded himself with people who expected strength. This was not about becoming harsh or unsympathetic, but about recognizing that true friendship sometimes required saying difficult things, and true support sometimes meant refusing to enable self-destructive patterns. The weak self had confused enabling with caring, comfort with love, and agreement with support. The strong self recognized that the highest form of care was holding others and being held to their highest potential, even when that standard felt uncomfortable. This applied most severely to the internal relationship between the weak self and the strong self. Compassion meant refusing to accept less than what was possible, not accommodating what was convenient. By day 20, the weak self had been largely silenced, not through suppression but through irrelevance. Its voice still emerged during moments of stress or fatigue, but it no longer carried the authority it once possessed. The strong self had become the dominant voice not through force but through consistent demonstration of superior results. The weak self promised comfort but delivered stagnation. The strong self demanded effort but delivered growth. The choice between these alternatives had become obvious rather than difficult, automatic rather than deliberate. This was the first part of transformation, establishing the foundation upon which unshakable strength could be built. The weak self had not been eliminated but had been reduced to occasional whispers rather than constant commands. Its infrastructure of support had been dismantled and replaced with systems that made strength easier than weakness. But foundation alone was insufficient. The second part of transformation would focus on building upon this foundation something that could not be destroyed by external circumstances, something that could not be shaken by the inevitable challenges that life would present, something that could serve as an anchor when everything else seemed uncertain. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because destruction comes from within or not at all. External circumstances can create pressure, but they cannot create weakness. Weakness is always a choice, even when that choice feels involuntary. The first part of transformation was learning to make that choice consciously rather than by default. Part 2, building the unshakable core. The morning of day 21 brought a different quality of challenge. The alarm still rang at 4:47 a.m., but Marcus no longer needed it. His internal clock had recalibrated to this rhythm, his body naturally stirring minutes before the mechanical confirmation. This was not about discipline anymore, this was about identity. The person who woke at this hour was not the same person who had once negotiated with the snooze button. The second phase of transformation began with a recognition that had been gradually emerging over the previous 20 days. Destroying the weak self was only half the equation. The empty space left by that destruction needed to be filled with something so compelling, so deeply rooted, so fundamentally aligned with truth that it could not be shaken by external circumstances. This unshakable core was not built through positive thinking or motivational mantras. It was forged through a different kind of process, one that tested every assumption, challenged every comfort, and demanded proof rather than accepted promises. The weak self had been sustained by illusions, the unshakable core would be built on uncompromising truth. The first truth was about capability. For 30 years, Marcus had operated under assumptions about his limitations that had never been tested. The weak self had been comfortable with these assumed boundaries because they provided convenient excuses for not attempting anything that might reveal actual capacity. Over the past 20 days, many of these assumed limitations had been systematically demolished. The body he had assumed was naturally unfit had responded to consistent training with strength gains that surprised him. The mind he had assumed was naturally undisciplined had maintained focus for hours when properly directed. The willpower he had assumed was limited had proven expandable when challenged progressively rather than overwhelmed suddenly. These discoveries led to a profound shift in self-concept. Not from low self-esteem to high self-esteem, but from assumption-based identity to evidence-based identity. Instead of believing he was capable or incapable, Marcus began operating from demonstrated proof of what he had already accomplished under specific conditions. This evidence-based approach to self-knowledge became the foundation for building unshakable confidence. Not the brittle confidence that required constant external validation, but the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what had been tested and proven. This type of confidence could not be shaken by opinion because it was not based on opinion. It could not be destroyed by failure because it incorporated failure as information rather than interpreted failure as identity. The second truth was about responsibility. The weak self had operated under the comfortable illusion that circumstances were primarily responsible for outcomes. Bad genetics, limited opportunities, difficult upbringing, unfair society. These explanations had provided relief from the burden of complete responsibility while simultaneously ensuring that real change remained impossible. The strong self recognized responsibility as power rather than burden. Every problem that was his responsibility was a problem he could potentially solve. Every outcome that was his responsibility was an outcome he could potentially influence. This shift from victim consciousness to ownership consciousness was not about blame or shame, it was about accessing the only point of leverage that actually existed, his own choices. This responsibility extended beyond actions to include responses. While Marcus could not control what happened to him, he could control his interpretation of what happened, his emotional response to what happened, and his decisions about what to do next. This level of responsibility initially felt overwhelming to the weak self, which preferred the illusion of powerlessness because it justified inaction. But, as this responsibility was gradually accepted and exercised, it became a source of tremendous strength. Every challenge became an opportunity to demonstrate this power of choice. Every setback became a chance to practice resilience. Every unexpected situation became training for adaptability. The third truth was about values. The weak self had operated with inherited values, beliefs about what mattered that had been absorbed from family, culture, media, and peer groups without conscious examination. Many of these values were in conflict with each other, creating internal tension that the weak self had tried to resolve through compromise rather than clarity. Marcus began the process of conscious value creation. Not choosing values that sounded noble, but identifying values that were actually demonstrated through his choices when external pressure was removed. This process revealed some uncomfortable truths about values he claimed to hold but didn't actually practice, and surprising discoveries about values he practiced but had never consciously acknowledged. Health emerged as a core value not because it was supposed to be important, but because every meaningful goal required physical and mental capacity to pursue. Relationships emerged as a core value not because isolation was recommended against, but because the most satisfying experiences involved contributing to others in ways that utilized his unique strengths. Growth emerged as perhaps the most fundamental value not because improvement was morally superior to stagnation, but because stagnation felt like death while growth felt like life. This was not a philosophical position but a visceral recognition that could be felt in the body and mind when comparing periods of challenge versus periods of comfort. These clarified values became the foundation for decision-making that no longer required extensive deliberation. Choices that aligned with health, relationships, and growth were obvious choices. Choices that undermined these values were obviously problematic, regardless of their immediate appeal or social acceptability. The fourth truth was about time. The weak self had operated under the illusion that time was scarce and, therefore, each moment needed to be preserved through minimal expenditure of energy. This led to the paradox of trying to save time by avoiding effort, which ultimately resulted in wasting time through lack of progress. The strong self recognized time as abundant but perishable. Each day contained the same 24 hours regardless of how they were used, but days spent building compound upon themselves while days spent consuming disappeared without trace. This recognition transformed time from something to be saved into something to be invested. This investment mentality applied to every activity. Exercise was not time taken away from productive work but time invested in the capacity for productive work. Learning was not time subtracted from earning but time invested in the ability to earn. Rest was not time lost from activity but time invested in the quality of future activity. The compounding effects of this time investment became visible around day 25. Energy levels that had been declining for years began to increase. Mental clarity that had been clouded by distraction began to sharpen. Physical strength that had been diminishing through neglect began to accumulate. These changes created a positive feedback loop that made continued improvement easier rather than harder. Success bred success not through motivation but through increased capacity. The stronger he became, the more strength he could develop. The clearer his thinking became, the better decisions he could make. The more energy he had, the more energy he could build. This was the opposite of the negative feedback loop that had characterized the weak self's patterns. Weakness had bred more weakness. Poor decisions had made good decisions more difficult. Low energy had led to choices that further depleted energy. Breaking out of that negative cycle had required enormous effort, maintaining the positive cycle required only consistency. The fifth truth was about environment. The weak self had assumed that environment was fixed and adaptation was required. The strong self recognized that environment was largely chosen and, therefore, could be consciously designed to support desired outcomes rather than undermine them. This extended beyond physical environment to include information environment, social environment, and mental environment. Every input that entered his consciousness was either building the person he was becoming or maintaining the person he refused to remain. There was no neutral input, everything was either helpful or harmful to the transformation process. News that increased anxiety without enabling action was eliminated. Entertainment that required no engagement and created no value was replaced with activities that demanded participation and produced results. Conversations that reinforced limiting beliefs were exchanged for interactions that expanded possibilities. This curation of environment was not about creating an echo chamber of positive thinking, but about removing influences that distracted from what mattered most. The weak self had been constantly influenced by random inputs that pulled attention in different directions. The strong self operated from clarity about priorities and, therefore, could evaluate whether any particular input supported or undermined those priorities. The social environment underwent the most significant transformation. Relationships that had been based on shared complaints were replaced with relationships based on shared commitments. Friends who gathered to consume were replaced with companions who gathered to create. Conversations that focused on what was wrong with the world were replaced with discussions about what could be built to improve it. This was not about becoming judgmental or superior, but about recognizing that environment shapes behavior and behavior shapes results. The weak self had been trying to change while maintaining environmental influences that supported the old patterns. The strong self recognized that lasting change required environmental alignment. The sixth truth was about suffering. The weak self had operated under the assumption that suffering should be avoided and that a life well lived was characterized by minimal discomfort. This led to a pattern of choosing short-term comfort that created long-term suffering, the suffering of unrealized potential, unfulfilled commitments, and unexpressed capabilities. The strong self recognized two types of suffering, the suffering of discipline and the suffering of regret. The suffering of discipline weighed ounces and was temporary. The suffering of regret weighed tons and was permanent. This was not a moral judgment but a practical observation that could be verified through reflection on any abandoned goal or unfulfilled promise. This recognition transformed the relationship with discomfort from avoidance to strategic acceptance. Discomfort that served a purpose became welcome. Discomfort that led to growth became sought after. Discomfort that built character became embraced as training rather than endured as punishment. Physical training became a laboratory for studying this relationship with discomfort. Each workout presented multiple opportunities to choose comfort or choose growth. The muscle burning during the last few repetitions was not suffering to be avoided but information about the boundary between current capacity and expanded capacity. Crossing that boundary required willingness to experience temporary discomfort for permanent benefit. Mental training followed the same principle. Learning difficult concepts required sustained attention that felt uncomfortable to a mind trained on instant gratification. Solving complex problems required thinking that was more difficult than accepting simple answers. Building new skills required practicing things that felt awkward until they became natural. This strategic relationship with discomfort became one of the most powerful tools for continued transformation. Instead of waiting until challenges felt comfortable, Marcus learned to act while challenges still felt uncomfortable. This dramatically accelerated progress because it eliminated the waiting period that had previously prevented most action. The seventh truth was about identity. The weak self had operated with a fixed identity, a collection of stories about who he was that remained constant regardless of evidence to the contrary. I'm not a morning person. I'm not good with money. I'm not naturally athletic. These identity statements had become self-fulfilling prophecies that prevented experiences that might contradict them. The strong self operated with a dynamic identity, a constantly evolving understanding of capability based on current evidence rather than historical assumptions. This identity was not proclaimed but demonstrated, not defended but tested, not maintained but continuously developed. This shift from fixed to dynamic identity was perhaps the most liberating aspect of the entire transformation. Instead of being limited by who he had been, Marcus became curious about who he could become. Instead of defending past versions of himself, he became excited about future versions. Instead of consistency with previous patterns, he pursued consistency with current values. This dynamic identity made rapid change possible because it eliminated the internal resistance that came from trying to act inconsistently with self-concept. When identity became something created rather than something inherited, every action became an opportunity to create the desired identity rather than maintain the existing one. By day 30, the unshakable core had been established. Not through positive thinking or motivational techniques, but through systematic testing and proof of fundamental truths about capability, responsibility, values, time, environment, suffering, and identity. This core was unshakable because it was built on tested truth rather than hopeful assumption. The weak self had been sustained by comfortable illusions that felt good but produced poor results. The strong self was sustained by uncomfortable truths that felt challenging but produced superior outcomes. This preference for truth over comfort became the defining characteristic of the unshakable core. External circumstances could still create pressure, but they could no longer create weakness. Pressure applied to the unshakable core only revealed its strength. Challenges applied to tested capabilities only provided opportunities to demonstrate those capabilities. Setbacks applied to evidence-based confidence only supplied additional evidence about resilience. This was not invulnerability. The unshakable core could still experience pain, loss, disappointment, and failure. But these experiences no longer threatened core identity or fundamental direction. They became information to be processed rather than verdicts to be accepted. The second phase of transformation had built something that could not be destroyed by others because it was not dependent on others for its existence or validation. It was self-sustaining, self-reinforcing, and self-expanding. The stronger it became, the stronger it could become. The more it was tested, the more reliable it proved to be. But even an unshakable core required ongoing maintenance and continuous development. The third phase of transformation would focus on the systems and strategies necessary to not just maintain this transformation but to continue expanding it throughout a lifetime of changing circumstances and increasing challenges. Part 3, the system of perpetual strengthening. The morning of day 31 carried a weight of significance that Marcus had not anticipated. The alarm still rang at 4:47 a.m., but something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer the beginning of another day in a transformation process, this was the first day of a transformed life. The question was no longer whether the changes would stick, but how they would continue to evolve. The third phase of transformation began with a crucial recognition: sustainable change required systems, not just willpower. The first 30 days had been powered by the momentum of novelty and the excitement of dramatic change. But novelty fades, excitement diminishes, and the real test of transformation is whether it can maintain itself when motivation becomes ordinary rather than extraordinary. Marcus had witnessed this pattern countless times in others and had experienced it himself in previous failed attempts at change. Initial enthusiasm would carry him through the first few weeks, but when that enthusiasm inevitably waned, the old patterns would slowly reassert themselves. The weak self would return not dramatically but gradually, making small compromises that seemed reasonable in isolation but collectively undermined the entire transformation. This time would be different because the approach was different. Instead of relying on motivation to maintain new behaviors, Marcus had spent the past month building systems that made the right choices easier than the wrong choices. Instead of depending on willpower to resist temptation, he had restructured his environment to minimize temptation while maximizing opportunity for growth. The first system was measurement. The weak self had avoided measurement because it revealed the gap between intention and action, between goals and results, between identity and reality. This revelation had been uncomfortable but also liberating. It was impossible to improve what wasn't measured, and improvement required confronting current reality rather than maintaining comfortable illusions about it. Every important area of life now had specific, measurable indicators that provided objective feedback about progress or regression. Physical fitness was measured not just by weight or appearance but by specific performance metrics that could be tracked over time. Financial health was measured not just by bank balance but by monthly investment rate, debt reduction, and spending alignment with stated values. Mental development was measured through reading pace, skill acquisition timelines, and problem-solving capacity in increasingly complex situations. Relationship quality was measured through frequency and depth of meaningful conversations, time invested in others' growth, and contribution to community rather than consumption from it. These measurements were not judgments but information. They revealed patterns that might otherwise remain invisible, trends that could be addressed before they became problems, and progress that might otherwise go unnoticed and, therefore, unrewarded. The weak self had avoided this feedback because it threatened comfortable self-deception. The strong self welcomed it because it enabled continuous improvement. The second system was routine. The weak self had interpreted routine as boring constraint that limited freedom and spontaneity. The strong self recognized routine as foundational structure that created freedom by automating decisions that didn't deserve conscious attention, preserving mental energy for choices that truly mattered. The morning routine had become sacred not because of superstition but because of results. Starting each day with physical challenge, mental preparation, and intentional focus created momentum that influenced every subsequent choice. This routine was flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances but consistent enough to provide reliable benefits regardless of external conditions. Evening routines had developed around reflection and preparation. Each day ended with brief review of progress toward meaningful goals, identification of lessons learned from challenges encountered, and preparation for the next day's priorities. This practice prevented days from blending together into weeks and months of unconscious living. Weekly routines provided larger perspective on daily activities. Every Sunday included review of the previous week's achievements and obstacles, planning for the upcoming week's priorities, and assessment of whether daily activities were aligned with longer-term objectives. This prevented the busy work from crowding out important work. Monthly routines enabled evaluation of systems themselves. The last day of each month included analysis of which routines were producing desired results and which needed modification. This meta-level review ensured that the systems continued to evolve rather than becoming rigid and, eventually, obsolete. The third system was environment design. The weak self had tried to overcome environmental influences through willpower. The strong self recognized that willpower was a finite resource that should be preserved for truly important decisions rather than wasted on resisting predictable temptations. The physical environment had been carefully crafted to make good choices automatic and bad choices difficult. Healthy food was prepared and easily accessible while junk food was absent from the house entirely. Exercise equipment was positioned where it would be seen and used while entertainment devices were stored where they required deliberate effort to access. The work environment supported focus through elimination of distractions and optimization of tools. The workspace contained only what was necessary for important work while everything else was removed or relocated. Digital environments were curated with the same attention. Apps that supported productivity remained easily accessible while apps that encouraged mindless consumption were deleted or buried in folders that required multiple touches to reach. The social environment continued to evolve around shared commitment to growth rather than shared consumption of entertainment. Time with people who challenged assumptions and supported development increased while time with people who enabled comfort and discouraged ambition decreased. This was not about becoming elitist but about recognizing that environment shapes behavior and behavior shapes results. The fourth system was learning. The weak self had approached learning as occasional consumption of information when it was convenient or entertaining. The strong self recognized learning as continuous skill development that compounded over time when approached systematically rather than randomly. Daily learning became as structured as daily physical training. Each morning included reading that challenged current understanding or expanded useful knowledge. Not casual browsing but focused study of material that could be immediately applied or that built foundational understanding for future application. Weekly learning involved deeper engagement with complex subjects that required sustained attention to master. These were not casual interests but strategic skill development that enhanced capacity to contribute value in areas that mattered most. The selection of learning targets was based on gaps between current capability and required capability for meaningful goals. Monthly learning included reflection on what had been learned, how it had been applied, and what additional learning was needed. This prevented the accumulation of unused knowledge while ensuring that learning was connected to action rather than remaining purely academic. The fifth system was contribution. The weak self had focused primarily on personal consumption and comfort. The strong self recognized that lasting satisfaction came from contributing value to others rather than extracting value from circumstances. This contribution began with immediate family and friends through increased presence, support, and investment in their growth rather than dependence on their validation. It extended to professional environment through higher standards of work quality, proactive problem solving, and mentoring others rather than competing with them. Community contribution developed through involvement in activities that built something lasting rather than just maintained existing conditions. This might involve teaching skills to others, supporting local businesses that aligned with personal values, or participating in projects that improved conditions for future generations. The selection of contribution opportunities was based on the intersection of personal strengths, community needs, and activities that could be sustained over time rather than pursued as occasional charity. This approach ensured that contribution became integrated into life rather than treated as separate obligation that competed with personal development. The sixth system was resilience. The weak self had assumed that setbacks indicated failure and that failure indicated inadequacy. The strong self recognized that setbacks were inevitable and that resilience was a skill that could be developed through practice rather than an inherited trait that some people possessed and others lacked. Resilience training began with small, voluntary adversities that built confidence in the ability to handle discomfort and uncertainty. Cold showers, difficult workouts, challenging books, uncomfortable conversations, these experiences provided practice in remaining effective while experiencing discomfort. This practice expanded to include failure rehearsal, deliberately attempting difficult tasks where failure was possible and sometimes likely. Not because failure was desired but because the experience of failing and recovering built immunity to the fear of failure that prevented most meaningful attempts. Stress inoculation became part of regular training through progressively increasing challenge levels in various areas of life. Physical challenges gradually increased in intensity. Mental challenges gradually increased in complexity. Social challenges gradually increased in significance. This progressive approach built capacity that could handle unexpected stress rather than just predictable comfort. The seventh system was adaptation. The weak self had tried to find a perfect system and then maintain it unchanged regardless of results or circumstances. The strong self recognized that circumstances change, goals evolve, and systems must adapt to remain effective rather than become obsolete. Monthly system reviews became opportunities to assess what was working well and what needed modification. This prevented attachment to methods that were no longer producing desired results while ensuring that effective elements were preserved and strengthened. Experimental periods were built into the schedule to test new approaches without abandoning proven systems. These experiments had defined timeframes and success criteria, preventing random changes while enabling systematic improvement. Feedback loops provided early warning when systems were beginning to degrade. These might include declining performance metrics, increasing effort required for previously automatic behaviors, or growing resistance to activities that had previously felt natural. By day 45, these systems had become self-reinforcing. The measurement system revealed progress that motivated continued effort. The routine system created momentum that made right choices easier than wrong choices. The environment system eliminated most temptations while maximizing opportunities for growth. The learning system ensured continuous development rather than stagnation. The contribution system provided meaning that transcended personal benefit. The resilience system built confidence that could handle whatever challenges emerged. The adaptation system prevented complacency while maintaining effectiveness. Most importantly, these systems had transformed the relationship between effort and results. The weak self had experienced a negative relationship, more effort was required to achieve diminishing results. The strong self experienced a positive relationship, less effort was required to achieve increasing results because the systems leveraged each other. Physical fitness improved more easily because nutrition supported training and recovery. Mental clarity improved more easily because physical fitness enhanced brain function. Relationship quality improved more easily because personal growth attracted other growing people. Financial progress accelerated because reduced consumption and increased capability created expanding surplus. This compounding effect meant that the transformation was not just sustainable but self-accelerating. Instead of requiring increasing effort to maintain progress, the systems enabled increasing progress with consistent effort. Instead of fighting against entropy, the systems created momentum that made continued improvement natural rather than forced. The weak self could never be completely eliminated because it represented the path of least resistance that would always exist. But it had been reduced from dominant voice to occasional whisper, from default choice to available option that was rarely selected because better options had become more accessible. The strong self had become not just the dominant voice but the natural voice, not just the preferred choice but the obvious choice, not just a temporary state but a permanent identity that was constantly reinforced through daily action rather than maintained through daily effort. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because destruction requires internal permission that the unshakable core no longer grants. External circumstances can create pressure, but pressure applied to strength only reveals more strength. Challenges can create discomfort, but discomfort experienced by someone committed to growth only provides more opportunities for development. The transformation from average to unshakable was complete not because perfection had been achieved but because the systems for continued improvement had been established and proven effective. The weak self had been systematically dismantled and replaced with structures that made weakness increasingly difficult to choose while making strength increasingly natural to express. This was not the end of the journey but the beginning of a lifetime of continuous development powered by systems that had been tested under pressure and proven reliable under stress. The foundation had been laid, the core had been built, and the systems had been established for a life that could not be shaken by circumstances because it was built on truth rather than comfort, on evidence rather than assumption, on contribution rather than consumption. The alarm would continue to ring at 4:47 a.m., but it was no longer calling someone to change, it was summoning someone who had already changed to continue becoming everything that change had made possible. The weak self had been destroyed not through violence but through irrelevance, not through suppression but through replacement, not through shame but through the simple recognition that strength served life better than weakness ever could. The 30-day transformation had ended. The lifetime of strength had begun.